Yes.
Keep it good. Can you hear me? Good evening, everyone. I'm not used to that anymore with the mask. And welcome back to the Austrian Cultural Forum. It's been over a year and a half since we've had any in-person events in this auditorium here, and it's a very special occasion. I'm Christian Ebner. I'm the Deputy Director here at the ACFNY, filling in for Director Michael Haider, who sends his best regards. He's still in Vienna. He was one of the masterminds and driving forces of getting this great exhibition here from Vienna, from the Jewish Museum Vienna here to the ACFNY, and we've been able to show this great show for almost half a year, from March until now. So we're all very excited that despite this rain, you all managed to come here and join us tonight, but also to have you on this very special finissage occasion, celebrating not only this exhibition, but the works and the lives of three very outstanding artists, Lili Renee, Bill Spira, and Paul Peter Porges. So first of all, let me thank, in their absence, Daniele Spera, Dr. Spera, who visited last week, the director of the Jewish Museum in Vienna, for bringing this show here to New York, and the two curators, also in their absence, unfortunately, Sabine Bergler and Michael Freund, who put this show together. But also to the families of Paul Peter Porges and Lili Renee in particular, especially those family members who are present with us tonight, Nina Phillips and Claudia and Vivette Porges, who have traveled from also far away to join us tonight. I don't want to say too much. We have an outstanding panel tonight and a discussion moderated by Mimi Bluestone. I just have the honor of welcoming on stage and introducing the president of the Friends of the Jewish Museum Vienna, Eric Hübscher, who will say please a few words of welcome. Enjoy this discussion, enjoy the show, thank you for coming. Mr. Hübscher, the floor is yours, thank you.
Still getting over a knee replacement surgery, so I'm sorry. So I want to echo Christian's comments, and it's absolutely wonderful to see some friends that I haven't seen in over a year and a half, and this is the first exhibit or first gathering that we've been able to have in a year and a half, and it's absolutely extraordinary. And those of you who have not seen the exhibit, you really missed out on a jewel. I want to thank the Austrian Cultural Forum of New York for its continued collaboration and friendship with the Jewish Museum at Vienna. We've had a long-standing relationship and a strong friendship, and it's really been remarkable for us. And I want to hope that all of you are staying healthy and getting through what is really turning out to be a dark part of our lives, but I think we're on the better side of it as opposed to where we were about a year and a half ago. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mimi Bluestone, who's going to lead tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Is this mic working? Can you all hear me? Yes, great. Okay. All right. Well, it's really a pleasure for me to be here tonight. I was invited to do this because my friend Michael Freund, who is in Vienna, asked me to stand in for him. He is one of the curators of this exhibit, and because of the pandemic, he's not here with us, which is really a great disappointment. But I feel really excited to be here with this great panel. And so I just want to introduce everybody. On my far left, David Nelson, who is really a historian, and will talk to us about Bill Spira. And David is an educator at the Holocaust Museum in Naples, Florida. Trina Robbins is an authority, really the authority on women in 20th century comics, and has a tremendous collection and great knowledge of the work of Lili Renee Phillips. And David Armstrong worked on the film about Lili Renee called Lili, and has an extensive background in film. And to my right is David Mankoff. David, listen to me. There are two Davids on my left, but there's a Bob on my right. Bob Mankoff is a cartoonist and was for many years the cartoon editor of The New Yorker, and now is the director of Cartoon Stock, which is an incredible collection of cartoon art. And so I want to start off by asking David Armstrong and Trina to talk about how you got involved in working on the, learning about the career of Lili Renee and working on the film about Lili Renee, and tell us about that.
Well, as Mimi says, whoa, my area of expertise is early 20th century women cartoonists, and the field was wide open for me because when men write histories of comics, they never write about the women, and in fact, some very well-known male cartoonists have been known to say that there were no women drawing comics in the early 20th century. So that's fine because there's this great big field for me. Lili, I had known about Lili for a long time, always known about Lili, in fact. I was a big fan of the company she worked for, Fiction House Comics. They're my favorite 1940s comic publishing company. And I guess it was in about 2005, Nina, maybe you can correct me, that I received an email from Nina Phillips saying, I am Lili Renee's daughter, and that we knew our mother had drawn comics. So I decided to look her up on the internet, and your name kept popping up because I've written about her. And I remember screaming, running to my partner and screaming, I just heard from Lili Renee's daughter! And I did not know that Lili was still with us. So I emailed her back and said, what can you tell me about your mother? And she said, well, you can ask her yourself. This is her phone number. So I've known Lili then for about 20 years, almost 20 years. And, her work is, maybe David, do you have anything you want to say yet? I'm sure you do.
You want to take your chance now? So I came to work on Lili because I had been a comic collector for most of my life and was familiar with Lili Renee's work. And I had seen the article in Newsweek that profiled her. And I got a call about 5 years ago from a friend of mine who said, do you know who Lili Renee is? I said, yes, of course. And he said, I have a friend of mine who's a director who's doing a documentary, and she's kind of stuck. She's been working on it for 2 years. And so, can you give her a call? So I gave her a call. And I waited, and I gave her another call. And then I waited, and I got another call. Adrienne works at Paramount and has a very high-level position, so it's hard to get a hold of her. But once I did, she sent me to a rough cut of the film, and it was a jewel. It was just, the story itself is wonderful, and we can talk about how that came about. But I said, yes, I want to stay here, I want to help out. We set a deadline. I set a screening at the Comic-Con in San Diego so that we would have an end date, so that we could actually target something to finish. And then I brought 4 or 5 people to work on the film to help finish it. And I tell you, I've worked in the past on other films, and after a while you get tired of watching it. I never get tired of watching this film, and I still get chills when I watch it. It's really about an amazing woman and an amazing life. Why don't you talk about Fiction House and how...
During the war, okay, first of all, the comic books had been a male domain. Heroes had been male. If there were any women, they were usually the girlfriend of the hero who had to be rescued. It was male artists who drew the comics, with very few exceptions. But when the war came, as in every other industry, the men were off fighting the war, and suddenly they were hiring women. So that really is how Lili got hired. At the point when Lili saw that ad saying that Fiction House wanted artists, she had never drawn a comic in her life. She didn't read comics, but she could draw, as you can see from her work. And all they wanted, if you could draw, they hired you. What was I going to talk? Oh, Fiction House, yeah. Now, Fiction House was very unusual, even for even for the fact that other companies were finally hiring women. Fiction House hired more women than any of the other publishers. And their stories, the stories that the women drew, had heroines. They didn't have muscular guys saving the heroine. They were Jane Martin, who was a nurse, a flying nurse, an aviatrix and a nurse. Senorita Rio, my favorite, who was a counter spy, disguised her in her alternative life. In her alternate life, she was a Brazilian nightclub entertainer. These were all, and they had the stories were in their name. It wasn't like they weren't just some character. The stories were about them, about these beautiful, courageous women. So Lily fit in perfectly. She drew the women, and she drew them wonderfully. My favorite was Senorita Rio, who Lily drew her in kind of Frida Kahlo clothes, or what would we call it, Chiquita Banana clothes, because it all took place in Latin America. Do you want to say something?
Yes. So working on the film, I got to fill in the blanks on her career by looking at dates. If you've seen the film, you know most of the story, but if you haven't seen the film, she left Austria in 1938 in the Kindertransport to live with pen pal in the UK, in Leeds. And she lived with that family for about a year. And after, she felt like she wasn't being treated properly, and she basically ran away from home. She was still 17 years old. She lied about her age and got a job as a nanny. Now, she grew up as an only child, so she hadn't really taken care of children before. So it was probably a new adventure for her, but she was willing to take it on, and she worked in Leeds probably for 2 years. Unfortunately, because she had left where she was staying, her parents had no clue where she was, and they had left Austria and made it to New York, so they were searching for her.
Also because in 1939, a year later, England declared war on Germany, so she lost all touch with her parents.
And so she ended up finally being found by a resettlement company that was based in the UK, and she got a ticket to the ship to go back to New York, and then she got to New York. She started doing local artwork until she saw the ad at Fiction House, which was about 2 years later. I mean, I looked at the dates of when the first signed work she did was in 1943, March of 1943, and the publication dates are about 3 months different from the actual work release dates. So she probably started working on that. It was Norge Benson, as a matter of fact, for Wings. Probably in late 1942, so that started her career, and she spent about 5 years working for Fiction House doing the characters. She also did a science fiction series called Lost World. All of them had major female characters because she loved drawing them. I mean, she did Werewolf Hunter and decided to make sure that it was something that she would like, because she said she didn't like werewolves. So she wanted to make it a little sexier, so she had a woman who danced in this exotic dance and turned herself into a cat.
She was good drawing women becoming cats because she did another story in Werewolf Hunter in which this evil magician turns the women into kittens and turns the kittens back into women. But Werewolf Hunter, she said that she did that because nobody else wanted to do Werewolf Hunter because it was all about werewolves and they were so sick of drawing wolves. So she was the one who said, well, let's just make it about the supernatural so that she could put in these beautiful, mysterious women.
Yeah. So she finished up her career at Fiction House and started working for St. John. She ended up getting married to Eric Peters. And together they did Abbott and Costello. Actually, there's a slideshow behind us that's showing all of the pages, a lot of the pages that she did for Fiction House. She did Abbott and Costello. She did all the figure work, and Eric did the faces. So that they
she did the women's faces, please.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, Eric did Abbott and Costello. and she finished up her comic book career in the mid-50s. 55 or 56 is the last time she actually did work. And if you saw the exhibit, you saw her children's book, and you also saw a lot of the personal drawings that she did on her own.
Oh, what happened after the war, as in every other industry, is that the men came back, the boys came back, and wanted their old jobs back. And that happened to comics. The men got their jobs back, and the women were no longer drawing the wonderful, courageous women they had drawn. But for a few years, I would say through about 1949, they could still do love comics and teenage girl comics, because that was okay. But no more adventure comics.
Trina, can you talk a little bit about what it was like for her to be one of the few women working in comics?
When she started, she was the first woman at Fiction House. Later, other women came, but at first she was alone, and she was so young. She was about 20 years old. A room full of young men. She said that the writers called the male artists, called them animals, and they were. And she said they were constantly sexual innuendos going around the room. They tried to teach her to curse in English. She said that there were times when she would go home and just cry herself to sleep.
But she did become friends with Fran Dietrich.
Fran
Who became
Hopper.
Fran Hopper.
Fran Hopper came later. Fran Hopper came about 2 years later or so. Fran, I've met her. I mean, she's no longer with us, but I met her and interviewed her. She had thought, she was an art student. She thought she was just taking a summer job when she went to work for Fiction House, but she stayed and they became best friends. Do you have anything to say?
I think we should let other people
Yes,
speak.
we should.
Well, I was going to actually ask David Nelson to tell us something about Bill Spira, who had a very different experience during the war.
I came across Bill Spira when I was actually looking into the work of Varian Fry, who was the American journalist who was sent across to Vichy, France in August 1940 with $3,000 strapped to his thigh and a list of prominenti to get out of Vichy, France away from the Nazis. And he and Varian Fry and the other people working for them got some amazing people out of Vichy, France. Marc Chagall, the painter, was one of his clients. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher. Leon Feuchtwanger, a writer. Max Ernst, the painter. He helped them to get out. And Fry came across Bill Spira working in the Marseille docks, knocking out caricatures of people for sort of 20 cents a time. And he said to he got him into his office and said, look, I can see you can draw. Have you ever forged a passport? And the chap said, well, if I had, I wouldn't tell him, but actually he was then employed by Fry to make fake passports and identity cards for the people to get out of Vichy, France. And apparently he could, with his pen, with a brush, could completely copy the Vichy identity stamp. So you couldn't tell it wasn't done with a rubber stamp, and that's what he did. He was taught how to do this. And so for a long period of time, he faked documents for Varian Fry and the Emergency Rescue Committee. I then started digging into Bill Spira, and I found a set of pictures which were in the Imperial War Museum in London, which were a completely different style, not caricatures, but they were like comic strips of pictures he'd made in a Auschwitz subcamp. And these are very unusual to find anybody doing paintings in a Auschwitz or any concentration camp, because this was dead against anything the Nazis wanted. Stealing paper was almost like a capital offence. So where he got the paper from, where he got the colours and the paints from, I do not know. But he made 13 drawings of prisoners in this camp. All sorts of types of people, from Soviet prisoners to French prisoners to British POWs to Jews to Jehovah's Witnesses. And these pictures, 13 of them, were acquired by a British prisoner of war in exchange for a few cigarettes. And that's how they got out to England. All these other pictures were destroyed. So that's how I learned. And I started looking into his career and discovered he was a great caricaturist and a very political operative in Vienna and Paris in the 1930s.
Okay, can you tell us anything about his life post-war?
Well, post-war, he was a classic survivor of the Holocaust, really. Some people were picked up and taken to camps and later released. Bill was first of all picked up in 1938 in Vienna after the Anschluss, because his father was a social democrat. He was very political. He was incarcerated in Vienna for a bit. He then got out of there. His parents went to Sweden. He could have gone to Sweden, but instead he went to Paris. He's then picked up by the Paris authorities because he's an enemy alien in 1939. He then spends about a year in various internment camps in France, starting off in Roland Garros, now quite a famous tennis stadium, and then various camps throughout northern France, middle France, 7 internment camps he was bounced around in, and eventually ended up in Marseille, where Varian Fry finds him. He's then later betrayed by somebody he was making probably a passport for. He's put into a prison in Marseille, transferred to yet another internment camp at Le Vernet in the south of France, and on September the 3rd, 79 years ago, on September the 3rd, 1942, the Vichy French handed him over to the SS. He's transferred to Drancy in Paris and ends up in 2 slave labour camps, which are sub-camps of Auschwitz. That's where he did these drawings. At the end of the sort of war, when the Russians are coming in from the west, from the east rather, he's on a death march from this Blechhammer camp to Gross Rosen concentration camp. From there he's transferred to Buchenwald. Buchenwald he's put on a train and ends up in the Theresienstadt ghetto in a cattle truck. And he's in the cattle truck with a lot of people who are dying. The Russians that liberate Theresienstadt leave the dead ones in the train. They think he's dead, but he manages to move his lips. And they say, oh, this one's still alive, get him out as well. Into the hospital in Theresienstadt, where he weighs 30 kilograms. That's 66 pounds, I think. And then from there he goes to Paris and starts again. And a fascinating story. There's 7 internment camps, 3 concentration camps, 2 slave labour camps, and a death march.
And resumed his work as an artist.
And resumed his work as an artist in Paris.
Yeah, quite a story. And then we have Paul Peter Porges, who was also young enough to be on Kindertransport and was sent to a place in France that was kind of a refuge for Jewish children from Germany and Austria, where apparently there was a big rivalry between kids from Berlin and kids from Vienna that eventually worked itself out. And then I guess when the Germans took over and they were moved to Vichy, I'm not exactly sure about all the history, but anyway, he was able to also make it to New York. He was very lucky. He was able to get into Switzerland and from there go to New York, where he was able to join his family. And so he had really a very successful career, and Bob is going to tell us more about it because Bob knew him and worked with him at the New Yorker.
I knew Peter, not in his extensive history. I mean, Peter and I both had studios down in Union Square. He actually told me more about his sexual escapades as a young man than these experiences, which is true. And I met Peter through Sam Gross. Probably, I started cartooning in about 1973. And I probably met Peter maybe in the mid-70s, through Sam. And to some extent, both Sam Gross and Peter were sort of mentors in a way, telling me a little bit what the deal was, with cartoons and how very hard it was when my parents were absolutely discouraging me from, what my... I quit a PhD program in psychology, and I told my father I was going to be a cartoonist for the New Yorker magazine, even though I didn't know that. And my father said, they already have people who do that. And I said, yeah, but one of them might die. And So it was a very tough profession. Peter and Sam had been through this, and I'm going to show, this is actually the first cartoon Peter ever had published in the New Yorker in 1965. You can see this is mobile. And one thing I'll say is that cartooning of this type, gag cartooning, doesn't get its due because partly it doesn't have to be explained, it doesn't have to be justified, it doesn't need critics, it's just enjoyed. And, but it's difficult. It can't be overdrawn, it can't be underdrawn, it has to be drawn the right way. And also, because it never elevates, it always diminishes, it always brings down. In other words, great art elevates. Humor is a de-dignifier. So, and in every one of these things, you will see sort of what's being de-dignified. But it's hard, and because often it has a caption. Let's go to the next slide. So, you know, Peter basically, it's very hard to get a cartoon in the New Yorker. When Peter got these first cartoons in, it would have been, well, this would have been when Jim Garrity, who is essentially the first cartoon editor of the New Yorker, started in 1939. There are other people, Ray Irvin and stuff, but a formal thing. And at that time, it was Jim Garrity and then Lee Lorenz and me, now a young woman, Emma Allen, speaking to more women, and there are much more women in cartooning now. But 3,000 cartoons would be shown, delivered to the New Yorker every week. So this cartoon, to get an okay, was very hard. And Jim Garrity was very sort of stingy about putting people on contract. It wasn't until Lee Lorenz came in. So here, this is another cartoon, producer, director, eroticist, and it's from '69. So Peter would have been very attuned to the events that were happening, and he would have to play off of those events. So '69, next cartoon, please. So this also is a kind of pop art reference for that. Actually, I see that sign all the time. That's where I live. The original hangs in New York State Thruway. So once again, this idea of taking things down a notch, making fun of it. Okay, so this is '75, the first kinds of digital clocks, and you can see the guy's wonderful drawing, incidentally. You see his surprise. Obviously 0, 0, 0, it's like time went back to 0. But also, a cartoon can't be overdrawn. And it's a difference between European cartooning, in which a lot of the comic part, the humor part, is done by exaggeration. It's done by making the people look funny themselves, rather than what I always said is, let the cartoon do the work. The cartoon is supposed to do the work. A big nose isn't supposed to do the work. A mugging isn't supposed to do the work. If you write a caption, don't put an exclamation point on it. That doesn't make it any funnier. Next cartoon, please. Okay, by the way, is this your entourage or my entourage? So this is '78, sort of from that period. Next cartoon, please. So this is a very good cartoon. 1983, there's this missile coming out. And these are very difficult cartoons to do. These cartoons, which are still a joke, have no caption at all, and my background in psychology, these cartoons are interesting in that they have to work in less than half a second. If you have to process too much, if you have to figure it out, if you're trying to make 2 jokes instead of 1, it's not going to work. Next cartoon, please. Okay, so this shows Peter's influence in art, because this is, I'm not sure exactly what the joke is, except it's sort of horrifying to see this Lucian Freud painting right over you as you're wondering. And I do like it. I think that's very skillful. You can't even see the psychiatrist. You can't even see him. And that's good also. Next cartoon, please. Okay, here's another thing in which Dauphin stopped teasing L'Infanta. So you can see this would also be, I would say, a uniquely New Yorker kind of cartoon of that era, in that we would assume that the people who are looking at it know Velázquez painting, and that Peter clearly did. Next cartoon, please. Okay, so this would have been, during the height of rollerblades. This is Hermes, lovely jokes. So I'm just saying, hard to do the joke. These are all good jokes. Next one, please. Maybe this is the last one. Okay. Well, okay, so that, I just want to show that as sort of a sample of, Peter's work, and he was a lovely guy and a friend of mine. I can still hear his, I just remember him smoking and wheezing out of that Viennese accent. But he was a lovely man, and I miss him.
Did he talk to you about his work at Mad?
Yeah, I was going to ask.
What's that?
Did he talk to you about his work at Mad?
He didn't really, and probably at that time, you talked about the Mad magazine, talked about the Jewish influence, and there I think you see the Jewish influence, not here, because it's interesting, the New Yorker, when I was there, and when Peter was there for a while, William Shawn was the overall editor. Now, William Shawn was the most un-Jewish Jewish guy that you could ever imagine. You know what I mean? First of all, you changed his name. His father his father made money, I think, selling like Swiss Army knives, and his name was Shawn. But during that time, nothing Jewish would be, for everybody's name in a cartoon would be Mr. Whitefield, Mr. Dearson. There were all these there would be no ethnicity in it. But in Mad magazine, I think, well, obviously it was the usual, the gang of idiots were pretty much all Jewish.
It was run by Bill Gaines, Al Feldstein, and Harry Kurtzman.
Right. And Mad was a big influence, I'm sure, on... See, it's interesting because Peter comes in, because, looking at the history, he comes here, I don't know when, 47 or 48, so he's 20. He's actually coming in sort of at maybe the tail end a little bit, but right in the middle of the golden age of magazine cartooning. When I was growing up, if every magazine would have a cartoon, you could actually make a living at that. So he could see that, well, this is a way, like someone like Misha Richter also, who came over. But it took, looking at the exhibit, I realized I see a drawing from 1950. So as of 1950, does not have the language completely mastered. Because one of the things in the drawing says, somewhere at Washington, rather than somewhere in Washington. And so I think that's interesting, because that would have, and it might have actually led to him, at least in the early stage, leaning more towards visual cartoons, which are more European anyway, generally, more visual kind of cartoon. So, that's mine. I don't have that deep, the family would know more about his travails, which I'm sure were many. Although I remember when I got a job at the New Yorker, and I also got a car, and I told them that I wasn't going to get a Mercedes because of Germany. He said, don't be a fucking idiot. Everybody in Israel has a Mercedes.
Well, I didn't know his work at all, other than probably tangentially seeing the New Yorker. When I went through the exhibit the first time, I actually laughed out loud at least a half a dozen times, like immediately. And I found his work to be spectacularly funny.
Yeah, it's great. He was a funny guy, and that is hard. I'm just saying to, just try, I'll tell you how hard it is. you can see how hard it is. I created the caption contest. Go look at the caption contest and try to come up with something. You see, oh, no problem, right? Usually people are blank. Well, a cartoonist runs their own caption contest. And also, another thing that should be noted is that Peter, submitting to the New Yorker and doing work for MAD, when he submitted to the New Yorker, would submit 10 and 15 cartoons every week. So that's the people don't submit one cartoon. So it's a lot, it's a lot of work. And I don't actually have all of Peter's cartoons in my archive, and I want to talk to the family about that. But first, of course, I have to scan all of Sam Gross's 32,000. Yeah.
I'm wondering if any of you see anything in the work of these three that speaks in particular to our current predicament, our current situation.
I was talking to my wife about this before I came down, and it struck me that there in 1940 France, there are people trying to get exit visas and affidavits and all sorts of things from people. And the current US state policy at the time, which was promulgated by a guy called Breckinridge Long, was to basically, he sent memos out to all the consulates to postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas. And this was the policy of the department. And people like Varian Fry and other people actually in the Marseille consulate decided they were going to ignore this message and try and get as many people out as they could. And so you've got there people forging documents and special immigrant visas, which is the sort of thing going on in presumably Kabul at the moment. There must be some very dodgy visas being presented at the gates, hopefully to get these people out. And they're getting a lot easier about letting people in now than they were in France 1940, which certainly struck me.
There was that ship, the very famous ship full of Jews that was not accepted, and they had to turn back and go back to Germany, and they were killed.
Yeah, most of them actually did get killed in Europe.
Yes.
The ones that survived are the ones that went to England. They went to England, to the Netherlands, to France, and to Belgium.
And South America.
Yeah. And a lot of the people on that ship actually ended up in the same camps that Bill Spira was in on one of his trips. I think the one in northern France had a lot of people off the St. Louis in that camp.
Kindred
Of course,
transport.
they would be picked up and then sent to Germany, and all of them were killed. I think of the 700 people on the ship, I think about 200 survived. The rest were all murdered in the Holocaust.
Kindred transport was really amazing. I think it really only lasted about 2 years, because then England declared war on Germany. But before that, as you probably all know, was an arrangement that England made with Germany to save children, anyone under 17. And thousands of kids, Jewish children, were saved, including Louis.
There was a gentleman called Nicholas Winton, who actually was, his real name was Vertan, he actually was Jewish, working in mainly Prague, and he basically forged his own certificate saying he was a special children's agency or something, and he got, I think, about 900 children out of Vienna and Prague and places like that. And he appeared on television. He didn't tell anybody about it, because these people don't do that. They say, well, that's what we did. And his wife found the list of names in his house once and said, what are all these names? He said, oh, whatever people are sort of arrested. So he appears on television, a program called That's Life. She's sitting at the front row there with some people, and the woman says, right, and the person sitting next to you was on the Kindred transport, one of the people you saved. And she's like, give it shake hands. And then she turns to the audience and says, anybody else here that was saved by Nicholas Winton, will you please stand up? And the whole audience stand up. It's absolutely beautiful. You can check it out on YouTube. It's a great thing. He's put the tears down his eyes. But he lived to be 102, I think, so he got his reward. And an OBE, and I think he was knighted as well. So, and that was a Kindred transport saviour.
Who would you say are the cutting-edge comic book artists, cartoonists of our time. And given how fragmented our media landscape is, what is their impact? Because we're all living in our own little media pods and not really communicating past them.
Well, I'm currently reading the latest graphic novel by Alison Bechdel. And she's just incredible. But you know what's so interesting, of course, is that back in the 40s, she couldn't have done this. You couldn't say you were a lesbian, you know, and that makes it so contemporary.
I look at the fact that I've been in the television and film business for 50 years, and all of the various social media change distribution. For example, I made an example of how television had changed, because in the old days there was Saturday Evening Post and Life and Look, and then there were a bunch of other magazines. Those magazines would have a circulation of 3 million. And sooner or later, the magazine business got diluted into very specialized distribution and publication, so that a magazine would only have to do 5,000 to 10,000 as a circulation in order for it to be successful. The same thing happened in the television business when the networks became cable networks and the cable networks expanded. The same thing's kind of happening with the comic book business. There used to be several main publishers. They had a limited number of distribution companies, and now the public media, social media has taken over. There's graphic novels, and they're published as real books and accepted and criticized and put into mainstream media.
And win awards, MacArthur Awards, Pulitzer Prizes.
Yeah, Art Spiegelman, for example, at Mouse. None of that would have been existing 35 or 40 years ago, and now it's become mainstream. And the dilution of that means that you can actually get into subject matters like Trina was talking about, that never would have been touched before, that has an audience that can be reached by, you know, raising the price so that it's $9.95 instead of $1.
Well, on the other side, in terms of the publishing industry sort of dying, and there being very few markets for the kinds of cartoons that Peter did, and what you have, and part of the reasons that I started originally the Cartoon Bank and cartoon stock is it's hard to make a living as a cartoonist. Hard to make a living, and people, they're posting on Instagram, you can have 40,000 followers, you can have, you know, no money. And so that is a problem. And also there's another problem in that the publications have to be directed now to their ad dollars, and therefore their views get distorted to their audience. They need to get distorted. You need to tell your audience, whether you're the New Yorker or the New York Times, exactly what they want. And you have to frame that regardless of, so the Times, I'm not a conservative when you say that, but I'm just saying what I've seen in terms of headlines and things is things become a kind of clickbait, and you have to absolutely appeal to your audience or they will go to an audience. Fox finds that out, right? Doesn't absolutely appeal.
And CNN.
If it strays on CNN also.
Yeah.
So I think you're in a time where if you're doing cartoons which have a viewpoint, you're basically preaching to your choir. You're having no influence at all, or maybe some influence. You're saying, like, you're the coach in the huddle. Yeah, go out, be on our side.
Providing entertainment.
Yeah, you're providing entertainment. On the other hand, I think there's interesting work done, not politically, but interior. Roz Trask, can we talk about something more pleasant about the death of her parents? This is was a book, I think, equivalent to something like Mouse, in that it touched upon a real topic with humor and feeling and opened that up. And I think someone like Roz is, yeah, of course, she's liberal and left, but she's not going to be, and one of the ways that, with graphic novels, but cartooning is strange, is the influx of young women into it, into all kinds of cartooning, because male cartooning of a gag type, even the kind that Peter did, or Sam did certainly, you don't know anything about the cartoons. You know they're funny. That's all you know, basically. They're funny, they make jokes, they're manipulating the outside world. As women came into all sorts of cartooning, you knew a lot about Roz. You know a lot about Leanna Fig. You know a lot about Alison Bechtel, and that's how it changed. And I think changed, and it's not like just women do these kinds of cartooning, but it changed the cartoon. Like if you look at, let's say, David Cypress for the New Yorker, you know what he's like. You know his, or Bruce R. Kaplan goes by the name Beck. You know it's a kind of diary, a human diary. So I think that the influence of women has.
The memoir, this is, in fact, I think that more women do memoir cartoons and comics than anything else. I think this is the majority of women.
Right, so I mean there's overlap in all of this and this influence, but it would be strange if women didn't do different cartoons than men.
It's also because the audience can identify.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
You were talking about Roz Chastain, can we talk about something? I forget the whole title.
Yeah.
But there have been a number of women who've done graphic novels about their parents growing old and dying. Joyce Farmer, Special Exits. Carol Tyler did two graphic novels about her father, starting with his memories of wartime, of when he fought in World War II. I mean, this seems to be, women talking about their fathers. And I did. My father wrote in Yiddish. I had his book translated and turned it into a graphic novel with a different woman artist drawing each chapter. A Minyan Yidden is the title of the book. A Minyan Yidden und andere Sachen, which I translated as a bunch of Jews and other stuff.
Leanna Fink, who I brought into the New Yorker, published a graphic novel called Bintel Breed. Yeah, so she also...
That's another one, yes.
Right.
Yes, I have that.
She also is someone who is telling you what her life is like and feelings like. And that relates very much to other women. But there are just somewhat gender divides, I'd say. And but let a thousand flowers bloom.
Although it sounds as though the influence of women is really spilling over onto some of the other male artists.
Somewhat, I think. Somewhat, I will say that certainly when I was coming up, you weren't saying anything about who you were. You were on the hunt for an idea. And you wanted to get that idea before somebody else got that idea. Because the idea was like these universal ideas, a kind of math. And I think that's true. There is a kind of humor math that guys tend towards, making up 100 jokes about jokes.
Well, and you'd also look through the newspaper to see if you could get hints about something that you wanted to do.
Well, of course. So, if I hear the word woke, then I'll create a cartoon where it would say toxic masculinity detox center, woke-ins welcome. But that will just be humor math to me. I won't, won't be, it'll be just, that's how I see the world. For me, humor is out there sort of being awake. I'm not saying so much like, every once in a while you do a cartoon about yourself, but it's like what's absurd out there rather than what's absurd in here, which is plenty, believe me.
What struck me interesting about the exhibition was that Lily Renee and Peter Porges sort of kept on going, whereas sort of Bill Spira disappears really out of the scene in the sort of 50s. I mean, he worked for 30 years after the war for French magazines, yet there's very little evidence of what he actually produced in that time. He wrote his autobiography in 1997, but it seems that he was basically destroyed by the Holocaust in his way. His wife, he had 2 children, one before he was actually put into the slave labour camp. I think he saw the child for about 2 weeks, and then she went off to Switzerland with him, and he only met him again in 1946, and he had a daughter in 1948. But his wife committed suicide in 1954. She threw herself out of a window. Now, she was a Ukrainian, Jewish Ukrainian, so I can only assume that maybe her family was destroyed in the Holocaust, and that preyed on her mind. And he must have had the same sort of feelings. I mean, because he says that he felt that, he had something important to say, but didn't quite know how to say it. And all this really political stuff was when he was a much younger person. Like you, he started at 16, his father said, no, you're not going to be a cartoonist. He said, I want to be a cartoonist. And he became a cartoonist. Very political stuff in Vienna. And then 1938-39, he's making these strip cartoons with pictures of people behind barbed wire, and cattle cars being taken to Dachau and Buchenwald and places like that. I mean, dangerous stuff. And yet, he could have gone to Sweden with his parents and forgone about it, but no, he stayed in
But
Europe.
he experienced a much more severe situation than, by an order of magnitude, than others did. And now we know a lot about post-traumatic stress and what that can do. And, let's say in the case of Primo Levi, who commits suicide, I think they become haunted by...
Many years later committed suicide.
Right, many years later.
Art Spiegelman talks about his mother committing suicide after the war, much later, but it just, what they went through, of course.
And the thing is, his cartoons, if you see the stuff from the mid-30s, has this much more spark than the later stuff, and it gets darker and darker as you...
His caricatures of people like Joseph Roth in Vienna and things, these wonderful dons with just a few lines. There's the person there, And he was able to recreate these things in the 1980s from his memories. You can still do a caricature of this guy, Joseph Roth, which was identical to the one he did in 1935. Unbelievable, sort of controlled the pen, this man had.
But it sounds like he didn't really connect with what was going on post-war in the way that...
Well, he stayed in Paris, didn't he, when he could theoretically have gone back to Vienna, but he felt that Vienna was not the place for him. I guess it had bad memories.
Of course.
Well,
People didn't want to go back. Lily didn't want to go back.
There is, I had this conversation with someone just before we came here, but the other thing is, you have to remember that artists are not necessarily the people who can actually promote their own careers properly. They want to sit at a drawing table and draw. And if you don't have a good agent or someone pushing you, I went to the Charlie Russell Museum in Great Falls, Montana. Charlie Russell would not have had a career if it wasn't for his wife pushing him. And that may have been true with some of the cartoonists who didn't make it after.
Well, there's got to be markets. You've got to actually have a market, or else now, since when I broke into the New Yorker and I got a contract with the New Yorker, I could get a mortgage. And I could be assured, the interesting about the New Yorker is whoever you were, we were never assured that they would buy a cartoon, but you were assured overall. And you could get Lee Lorenz, who was the editor, or William Shawn, to write a letter to a mortgage company and saying, you can't do that anymore.
No.
So many of the people, there are very few people who are just, that's it. They're not like as Peter Arnold could be, a Charles Adams, and you get side gigs, advertising gigs and all of that, but you could say, this is my job. I'm going to do this every week and submit. Now, a lot of the people that came in when I was there, because they're not being published as much anymore, they're comedy writers, they work in advertising, and so that may have happened somewhat. Now, did he stay in Paris?
Yeah, in Paris.
Well, Paris would have been less economically viable in the ways that the United States, although obviously it suffered during World War II, it's not the same kind of thing. You're coming over here and there's more economic opportunity. So when Borges comes over and he's 20, whatever, they got work. They can sell, and that's, I don't know the actual history of Peter, like when he sold his first cartoon, but it's a huge thing when somebody pays you money the first time for a drawing and you see it in print. And so, that gets you going. and it doesn't have to be much, but you start getting paid for it, and then there's a period in your life when you start on something like this, whatever it is, that your brain really burns. It's like you're not a kid anymore, you're in your 20s. There's been stuff building up all this time, and it just starts to come out. You have all that energy, but you need a market. You need a market, and there's a lot of luck involved. For example, I never would have been a cartoonist for the New Yorker if Jim Garrity was there. He was like a curmudgeon by that time in the 70s. Lee Lorenz came in, he was only 42, and he was looking for a new bunch of people. So you got to be lucky too. You just got to be
Right place at the right time.
Absolutely. And with some perseverance, though.
And talent,
Yeah.
clearly. I wonder if there's anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question of the panel.
Pass around the microphone.
Very small.
Thank you. Actually, I think David Nelson started to take the discussion where it was to some area that I was hoping to hear about. That was what's the effect on these artists having been survivors coming from Vienna? How did that affect their work? I mean, we get into some specifics. You started to go there with, and I think that's the commonality that I think brings us together tonight.
It seems that when he got out of the concentration camps, he never sort of shook off Vienna, I think, because even the Holocaust, because when he started to do book illustrations, the two books he did illustrations for that I found were books written by a guy called Hammerschlag, who himself was a victim of the Nazis and died in Auschwitz. So he never sort of got away from it at all, I think. And I think he got a staff job on his French newspaper and just sort of kept his head down, doing drawings, a bit of photography. And that was it, really. It seems that it sort of hung over him, but he never got as political again after the war as he had been before. His pre-war stuff was pretty heavy political, anti-Nazi illustrations. And there's one section, I think he worked for the Austrian Post, which was like an émigrés newspaper in Paris, and he worked with a poet, and the poet would write rhymes and he would illustrate them. And there's one section from, I think it must be 1938, and it's got drawings of things that you think, well, people denied this was happening in the 1940s. And it's people in boxcars and in cattle trucks and behind barbed wire and being taken away. And Kristallnacht, buildings burning, and all that sort of stuff, which he did in 1938. And he didn't sort of come back to it after the war, really. He did other things.
Well, Lily, during the war, the big villain in American comics were the Nazis. And Lily's heroines were fighting the Nazis all the time. In fact, Senorita Rio fought Nazis as long as 1947. So, because they were such good villains, and they were always like people who want to bring back a Fourth Reich or something like that, for her to discover. So she was fighting back at the Nazis with pen and paper. That's what she did, and I know she loved it.
But I don't think the Holocaust, when I was growing up, I don't even know really if it was so much the Holocaust. I knew the 6 million. My parents were born in 1907 and 1908. So obviously people know about the death camps from the newsreel, but it doesn't sit as it does now historically, the magnitude of it. Because just the history that comes out, the complicity, all of the sorrow and the pity, just what happened. So when you look at movies from the 40s at that point, it's, the Nazis are the villains, but they're just sort of like regular horrible villains. The magnitude of the evil isn't there.
No, and the other thing is there's a line that Lily says in the movie where she says the Nazis were very good at it, they were very ordered, and they were good about doing everything. They did the Holocaust. So she obviously has it in her memory. I think culturally, probably most of her life. But I think that she got to avoid, having left Austria in 1938, she got to avoid any of the direct involvement. I think that her life was complicated, And I think that she had personal dramas that she thought about afterwards. She talks about it in the movie.
Well, she was not in a concentration camp, but she definitely experienced the persecution. She experienced Kristallnacht.
Yeah.
She was there. She talks about being herded, she and a bunch of other Jews who were waiting online to get something stamped. She says in those days you were always waiting online for something. And how suddenly the Gestapo ordered them all into this synagogue. And they just stood there. What is that?
I think it's an Amber Alert in San Francisco.
Oh, flood warning.
Oh, is that Amber Alert? It's the middle of the night, I can't get out on the highway.
It's a flood warning in San Francisco.
In San Francisco, yeah, exactly.
Anyway, so they were just stood there, guarded by the Gestapo in this
She said that the guy looked at him as though she could kill him.
hate, such hatred in his face. Yes, yeah. So she certainly, you know, even though she was not in a camp, she certainly experienced it. Yeah.
But to some extent, I know, of course, my parents weren't there, my parents were first generation Jewish immigrants born in 1978. And on the Lower East Side, a lot of anti-Semitism, obviously. They wanted to put all that behind them. They wanted to sort of like put it in the past. You know, my father said, well, maybe we should go back to Russia, you know, to visit. We're not going back to Russia. You know what I mean? They just wanted to put that, okay, we're American or we're Jewish, we're proud of being Jewish, but that, they wanted to forget about it. And I'm sure some people who didn't experience, first of all, some people could not forget about it because of the horror of it. But to extent, I don't know to what extent, you know, Peter at that time, let's say Borges experienced, you know, trauma that he took with him. So that's the important thing. Was there actual, you can go through some pretty bad situations and it not be traumatic, and then there are situations that you can't avoid to come. So I think for some people, maybe they just wanted to forget about it, others they couldn't. I think there was a question.
Yeah, I have a question about, in seeing the exhibit, it looked like a lot of the items were currently property of the Jewish Museum in Vienna. I was just wondering if anybody knew if they were donated by family members of these artists or collectors that then donated their collection, or they were acquired individually, piece by piece. Does anybody have any information as to how all of those things came together in this one place?
I think Lily's stuff came from collectors. Trina's original artwork is on the wall in the back when you walk in. And the rest came from the family and her personal stuff.
Yeah, I think Simon Spira gave quite a few of the pictures that are there. She also collected them. And I said the Imperial War Museum has these colour strip cartoons. There's about 4 up there, which you really ought to have a look at. They're terrific stuff. But talking about survivors, I mean, I had a neighbour in Birmingham, England, who was in Auschwitz. And when she actually got out with her mother and was rescued. When she got back to England, they basically said, we don't want you to talk about it, we don't want you to frighten the children, whatever. She kept quiet about it for a very, very long time. And then in 1978, a television producer took her back to Auschwitz. And she made a 90-minute documentary called Return to Auschwitz, where it's some pretty heavy stuff, where she finds she's digging around in the ash pits to find bits of bone and stuff. And she was in the Canada section, which was the sort of loot effects lager, as it were. And she was a survivor of that. And now she goes back regularly. I mean, she's getting on a bit now, in fact, she's nearly 90. But she used to go back with school children there and do trips, because she saw it, you know, eventually as this was her job.
Yeah.
You know, she lost her education. Therefore, she was going to make sure that education was given to these children. And actually, I went back with her once myself, which was fascinating minutes. And you know, she took me to where her hut was, and where she sat on the grass and watched the guy climb the ladder and pour the crystals down through the pipe. I mean, she saw all this as a girl of 15, 16, 17, I guess she was. But she was a survivor. As you said, you had to be invisible. That was the trick.
I think it was actually the Eichmann trial that opened up the general discussion of what had happened. I think up until that point, there was a great desire not to speak about it on the part of a lot of people.
I know in the World War II veterans, my father and actually my wife's father, who was dropped behind lines on D-Day, and he never really, Corey, my wife says, he never really talked about it much. Didn't want to talk about it much. Probably because of what, people are thinking, oh, it's a John Wayne movie. It's not a John Wayne movie. It's people, it's your buddies getting killed and blown up and you're having to kill people. It's not something that he would talk about. A class of people just repressed it. I think now it's different. It probably helped that people express it, but then they didn't.
We didn't know during the war. I think one of you guys mentioned that we didn't really understand about the concentration camps. We had no idea the extent of what they had done, And I remember, I was very young, but I remember when Israel was made a state, was accepted as a state by the United Nations, my mother was listening to it on the radio and crying. And I didn't understand why she was crying. My older sister took me aside and she explained to me.
Well, it's interesting to talk about World War II. Life publishes a photograph, maybe in '43, of 3 dead Americans on a beach. That's the only photograph that's shown during World War II of dead people. It's not
censored.
Yeah, it's not like the Civil War, which actually people are seeing
Piled.
what it is, actually what really happened. Here in World War II, it's all John Wayne. There's just 3 Americans, and they're not like their bodies are mangled. They're dead. They're washed up. So that's, in a way, the conflict in general was hidden.
Nina Phillips has something to say.
I was just going to say something about my mother. She obviously, it was necessary for her to do the comics that she did and fighting the Nazis this way. This was very therapeutic for her. But growing up as a child, my mother to this day really doesn't talk about it at all. Very, very occasionally there'll be some little snippet that will come out for friends ostracizing her and coming up and saying, I can't be your friend anymore because you're Jewish, this kind of thing. And the story that you just told about being on the line. But it's so deep in her that she just doesn't go there. That's what I have to say. I don't think she was in England for that long time, actually. I want to correct that. But that doesn't matter.
Maybe we have time for one more question, if there's anybody who has another question. And thank you, Nina, for sharing that.
This is a question to Mr. David Armstrong. So at the time, a lot of media professionals had to change their last names, especially during the Cold War. And I wonder if the same happened with the cartoonists, like what had happened with script writers and film directors and journalists. So do you know stories like that and how that displacement impacted their identity and their work?
I could perhaps say something about Wilhelm Spierer as he was born. He then ended up going to Vienna, where he first of all started doing cartoons under the name 50. And then when he came across to France, he destroyed his passport and started calling himself Bill Fryer, which means more free. So Fry and Fryer were working in Marseille. And then later it becomes Willy Spierer. And he ends up as Bill with one L Spierer in Paris. So he changed his name quite a lot. but he was actually a Viennese Jew born Wilhelm Spira.
So, are you talking about in the entertainment business?
Yes, I know his did.
Well, there are a lot of people that change their names for various reasons. It depends on what area you're talking about. I mean, obviously the
I was talking about the Cold War and the blacklisting.
The McCarthy era changed a lot of people's names, and some of them got completely different names and worked under assumed names so that they could continue working. That's pretty common. I think most of the people came out of that in the early 60s. I mean, Dalton Trumbo was hired by Stanley Kubrick to do Spartacus,
Yeah.
and when he was hired, he was able to use his name for the first time in 10 years. I think that basically ended the blacklist in terms of those that were identified as communists during the McCarthy era. And then there are people who changed their names for various reasons. You know, some people got their names changed because the people at the immigration desk couldn't understand what they were saying. And they changed their name for them based on what they thought they heard. That happened a lot in the early 20th century. But in the entertainment business, by and large, I think the blacklist is the only thing that kept people from using their real names.
I don't think so. In comedy, it was very important to be not too Jewish. And whether it was Jack Benny or George Burns or various, even like Woody Allen, whenever people change their names because there's an interesting book, The Haunted Smile, about the conflicted nature of Jewish comedians in the 30s
Well,
and
they
40s.
all came from the Borscht Belt.
Well,
They
I
all
was going
were
to say,
Jewish.
20s, 30s, and 40s, I think that's true.
Yeah,
But in current times,
right.
I don't think it's an
No,
issue.
in the current times, but then it definitely was.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, most people didn't think Jack Benny was Jewish or George Burns, and that was even, it's interesting, you know, originally, whoever, I think it's Seinfeld, Seinfeld was saying it's too New York. What they meant was it's too Jewish, and they didn't think it was going to play, which of course it did, because now everything's Jewish.
And in comics, when comics first started and during the war, they all anglicized their names. I mean, Jack Kirby, he was Jacob Kurtzman, you know, Kurtzberg, sorry. Stanley was Stanley Lieber, you know, they all changed their names, they all anglicized it. It was expected, I think.
Yeah. Well, also they felt that they were going to be more accepted in the business world, which probably was
When
true.
I was growing up, my mother said, you know, you could change your name to Robert Mann. Honestly, so this is, even then in the 50s, because I was born in 44, it was this idea.
What did you tell her?
What is that?
What did you tell her?
Told her, fuck off.
Well, I think, yeah, I think we all
And
have
she said,
stories
just change it to
about.
fuck, not
Yeah.
fuck.
Yeah, I think we all have stories about names
Yeah.
being changed. I think we're kind of out of time here, but this has been a really.
Thank you so much to this amazing panel for this fascinating discussion, for sharing your insights, your stories, your views, and for bringing those three outstanding artists again closer to us. Thank you also to our team, to Nina Monschein, the head of our gallery, for putting this all together. At this point, we usually invite our guests for a glass of wine, which unfortunately we decided wouldn't be the safest thing to do so, but instead, and after you hopefully get a chance to view the show one more time before the installation next week. So please stick around, and on your way out, you will find a little goodie bag that Nina and our colleagues have put together for you. There's also a little treat for those of you in particular who celebrate the forthcoming high holidays, and we wish you, those who celebrate, a very sweet and healthy and happy good new year and a Shana Tova. And thank you so much for coming all tonight. get home safe and hope to see you at one of our next shows. There will be information about this show remaining on our website, on our YouTube channels, with interviews with the family members, gallery tour online, so please continue to enjoy this and keep the memory and the works of those artists alive. Thank you so much for coming. Good night.